Okay, so the recording has just started. Welcome back to the Manhattan GMAT Study Hall. Again, here's the cover page, so to speak. October 11th, we are going to continue our discussion of assumption problems from the previous study hall. We've already covered the rules before the recording was turned on, so that is not part of this recording. So we're going to jump right into some problems. What you are about to see is this. You're about to see these multiple choice options. These should just have appeared now underneath your name. So look underneath your name, you should see this menu of options for multiple choice questions. It's really important that you respond with these options and not in the chat box, because remember that everybody sees the chat box. So if people are seeing your answer, that's not really fair to everybody else, because that might have an influence on what people pick and so on. So when you get a question that's multiple choice, please select your multiple choice option from this menu, and not from and don't just type a letter in the chat box. So thank you. You don't need to type a letter now, Sai or anybody else. I'll go ahead and clear those out. But just make sure you know where those are at. Also, the problems on these pages are all from GMAT Prep software. Unlike the official guide, the GMAT Prep software is something that we can use because it is free and freely distributed. So that's a source that we can use. All right, so again, the topic is assumption problems. Let's just review. We saw this last week, so we'll try to do this at an accelerated pace. But let's do some quick review of what assumptions are and of basic techniques for handling this before we go on to some problems. So let's review what is an assumption. Can anybody tell me in the text box, quick summary, what do we actually mean when we say assumption? Like, what is that? What's an assumption? Yeah, it's something, Pete, perfect. It's necessary for the argument to be true. And yeah, this is actually an excellent summary, Emmanuel and Pete. Such a good summary that I'm just going to throw those on the board and let them do the talking. So here's what these two gentlemen wrote. It's exactly what. Perfect summary. Yeah, and assumption is something that's necessary for an argument to be true. So there's a more expansive discussion of this in the last study hall that we did, so feel free to check that out if you want a more thorough introduction to this. But necessary here is the key word. In other words, an assumption is something that must be true if the argument is to work. So it's something that you need. Key word here is need. It's something that you need. The danger is things like this, where one person wrote unstated premise. The problem with unstated premise is that it's not really exact enough. Like, this may not really convey the idea that it's necessary. So let me give you an example, just to make sure we're all on the same page here. Let me give you an example. So this, but when you say this, unstated premise may not convey the idea of necessary. So be careful. Like, let's say you have something like this argument. If you have, I think I gave this argument last week, so I'll just use it again. Marco is Italian, therefore Marco likes to take naps in the afternoon. There's an argument. So one thing that is an assumption would be Italians like to take naps in the afternoon. That's actually a necessary statement. We need this for the argument to work. So this is an assumption. On the other hand, if you have something more broadly ranging, like if you had something like Europeans like to take naps in the afternoon, then this is not an assumption because you don't need it. Like the only thing you need here is information about Italians, not about Europeans in general. So we don't need this statement. So it's not an assumption. So this is my warning that I'm trying to give you about unstated premise, is because here's the problem. The problem is that the second one of these, like if you put this into the argument, then it does work. And that's the problem. Like in other words, if you have Marco as Italian and Europeans like to take naps in the afternoon, then you would know that Marco likes to take naps. On the other hand, that's not the issue. The issue is not if I insert this, then does it help? The issue is, do I need the statement? And those are very different questions. So, and when you say unstated premise, I think a lot of people mistakenly think that includes both of these. Because an assumption is not just a premise that if you add it, it works. Just make sure this is crystal clear that an assumption is something that is necessary. Any questions about this, please type them in the box. Otherwise, that's what an assumption is. If you want to think about it as a definition, you've got a definition. Then, if negated, the argument is destroyed. So this is true because this is what necessary means. Like if you had to give a definition of necessary, this is probably what you would give, right? You know, like if water is necessary for humans to live. What that means is if you take the water away, then humans die. So if you don't have it, then it doesn't work. I mean, ordinarily this would just be a cute fact about assumptions. But because you have multiple choice questions, this gives you an extraordinarily useful method for dealing with them. This is an extraordinarily valuable method for dealing with multiple choices. Because you can just try the choices, you can try to negate them, and you can see if they do destroy the argument. So for each answer choice, you can negate it, you can make it false, see whether it destroys the argument. If the argument is destroyed when you make the choice false, then you've got an assumption. So you try this with Marco. The assumption is Italians like to take naps in the afternoon. If you negate that, you get Italians don't necessarily like to take naps in the afternoon. So that's the opposite. If Italians do like to, make that false. Italians don't like to. Don't like to take naps in the afternoon. If this is true, then the argument definitely doesn't work anymore. So you found an assumption. Any questions about this? These are the basics that you need to know about assumptions. They are necessary, and you have this very powerful method of negation, where if you have multiple choices that are potentially assumptions, then you can just make them false. and you can see what kind of effect that has. Any questions about this, please put them in the text box. Otherwise, we're going to get started on some problems. Okay, so remember all of the problems here are from GMAT. They're from the GMAT prep software. So copyright attribution, they own the problems. You can distribute them because they're free software, but the problems are the property of GMAT. When we put multiple choice problems on the board, again, in case you weren't here to see this the first time, you should see letter options underneath your name. Please select one of those options for your multiple choice. Please do not post a letter in the chat box. Let's go ahead and do a problem. Here's a problem. Put a stopwatch on the board. And I will, again, please pick a multiple choice answer from the menu of multiple choice answers, which is located here. Go for it. Okay, go ahead and pick an answer, please, if you don't have one. There's about 4 or 5 of you don't have an answer yet. Oh, you can see the answers. Sorry. Now you cannot. You should no longer be able to see them. Probably a little late for this problem, but from now on you won't see each other's answers. So thanks for the reminder. Okay. Anyway, please pick an answer if you haven't already. That's Amit and Anna and just the 2 of you. Okay, so let's take a look. Also, when you read these passages, it doesn't look like this one was too much of an issue for people, because we have a very strong majority here. But still, let's go ahead and discuss. Remember, when you read the passages, we also discussed this more fully in the last session, so if you want the whole discussion, check out the last study hall. But when you read the passage, and this goes for any critical reasoning question, not just assumption questions, you should try to do 2 things. Number 1, you should try to personalize the passage, meaning to actually give the speaker a name, so that you, in your head, you should be in a conversation with someone. If that sounds weird, the basic summary is that we are humans and not computers, and it's much easier to think about what is Joe's point than it is to think about what's the conclusion. I mean, objectively, those things are the same, but from the human mind standpoint, they are not. So you should try that, and then you should always, at least in your head, put the passage into your own words. So here, there's still, get rid of the kind of lofty written language here and get this into more understandable terms. So technological conservatism, like bike manufacturers, are not very adventurous when it comes to technology here. The only bike racers who care about innovation, so all innovation comes from bicycle racers. So basically what the passage says, all innovation comes from bike racers. Therefore, because that's where the demand is, actual innovation is limited to things that are standard for competition. So, all innovation in bikes will have to do with racing standards. So what do we need here is the question. So if you look at this argument, you can just kind of see what's missing, right? Like this connection between innovation and innovation, nothing's missing there because that's the same in both. They're both talking about innovation. So fine, that's okay. But where there's a missing connection is this. This is talking about coming from bike racers. But then they jump from that to, oh, it has to do with racing standards. Those are not the same, and one of the big skills that you want to have when you do assumption problems is recognizing when things are not the same as each other. So when things are not the same, but the argument treats them as though they were, you need an assumption to connect those. So we need to assume that comes from bike racers is basically equivalent to having to do with racing standards. You got to connect those. So that's going to be C here. I mean, C states it in kind of an indirect way, but bike racers do not generate a strong demand outside racing purposes. So this means that they only generate demand within the universe of racing standards. Any questions about this? So we have some takeaways from this in a second. If you have questions, go ahead and type in the text box. Notice you probably didn't really have to do this on this problem, but you can also do the negation method. And by the way, when you review problems, it's a very good idea to go figure this out, even if you thought the problem was easy. Like, even if you found the problem easy, try to go back and find other ways when you review the problem. So if we try negation on choice C, what's the negation of choice C? If you make choice C false, what does it say? Go ahead and tell me in the text box. Nobody. If you negate choice C, if you make it false, what does it say? I see one or two people typing. So yeah, you can just take out the word not. That's a good way of summarizing it, because it's a very nice statement for negation. It just, you take out the do not part. So if you take that out, then what you have is bicycle racers do generate a strong demand. So bike racers do generate a demand for things that are not directly involved with racing standards. So if this is true, then I think we can see that this destroys the argument completely. If this is true, if this is the case, the argument is destroyed. So there you go. Emmanuel, okay, I mean, just if you're typing that for someone else, then just direct. You can pick individual people to send messages to. So, okay. Can you place not in a different part of the sentence? Miles, I guess I don't really understand the question, because I don't get what you mean by can you do that. I mean, if you mean can the sentence be written that way, the answer is it could, but it wouldn't mean the same thing. Now, maybe you can explain a little bit more. But making things false, you should not need to memorize rules for how to make things false. So like making things false is basically just a matter of normal human common sense for the most part. Because it's not as, I mean, if you tried to make rules for how to make a statement false, it would actually be very hard to do that for the most part. Like, for instance, if I say everybody in this room is tall, the negation of that is not everybody is short. It's at least one person here is not tall. And memorizing a rule for that would be kind of hard, but just kind of thinking about it for a little bit is not hard. So when you negate the statements, you should try to do them just intuitively with kind of regular common sense reasoning or whatever you want to call it. That'll help. But you can't put a not in another part of the sentence, otherwise you don't. Otherwise you're not making the statement false. If you do that, you're making a totally different statement. I hope it answers your question. Are there any other questions about this particular problem? Okay, someone's typing. While someone types, as far as general lessons from the previous problem, one lesson from the previous problem is how this works. I mean, we did mention this in the last assumption study hall as well, but one way to identify assumptions directly is if you see a jump in the logic, like if the argument treats two different things as though they were the same, then you have to connect them. So that's one type of assumption that you will see fairly often. One thing that you can also do here to get more personally involved with this, because personal involvement is a very, very big deal. One thing that you can do to become more personally involved here is try making your own examples. Okay, someone accidentally clicked video, so I'm going to disable the video permission. Okay, yes, you can. We'll talk about the timer thing in a second. To get more personally involved with this material, try making your own examples. So in this example, the disconnect was between bicycle racers want it, and it has to do with racing standards. Those are not the same. Like if I had to make my own example, I would say something like, of the people convicted of crime X, 3 times as many had mental disease Y as in the general population. Therefore, people with mental disease Y are more likely to commit crime X. So this is my example of the same sort of problem that's in the bicycle issue. In this case, the disconnect is between people who are convicted of a crime and people who actually do the crime. Like, those are not the same. Like, as you know, a lot of people don't get caught committing crimes, and a lot of people are falsely convicted. So these are not the same. So therefore, you would need an assumption that these are like proportional to each other, but something to connect these ideas to each other. So but making your own examples is a big thing It's very hard to really master these concepts if you don't actively make your own examples. So give that a shot. Let's talk about this question really quick. This is sort of an unrelated topic, but it's important to talk about. Since it's unrelated, let's put it on a new page. Can we hide the timer on the GMAT? There is a message underneath that says nope. That's wrong, so I hope that wasn't a response to that question, because yes, you can hide the timer. You can hide it and unhide it as many times as you want. So now let's talk about what should you do. Like when you are taking the test in general. Kapil, is that true? It automatically shows up when there's 5 minutes? That's interesting. I don't think I ever knew that. But when you're taking the test in general, what do you think you should do? So let's make this a multiple choice question type thing. If you think that you should generally show the timer, pick A. If you think that you should generally hide the timer, pick B. So in other words, if you think the timer should be on the screen most of the time, pick A. If you think the timer should be hidden most of the time, pick B. Okay, most of you are picking A. In general, no, it's not really a good idea. You should generally hide the timer. You should not have the timer on the screen most of the time. And let's talk about why. In general, it's a bad idea to have the timer on the screen. Having the timer on the screen is a bad idea, regardless of whether you look at it. Like if the timer is on the screen and you look at it, then you're wasting a lot of time. I mean, people don't really understand just how much time is wasted by looking at that clock over and over and over again. Because remember that you can't just look at a clock. There's no such thing as just taking a glance at it. Like if you look at a clock, then automatically your brain will subtract the times and recalculate and then sort of recalibrate your timing strategy and probably stress out a little bit. And there's this whole mental process that gets kickstarted when you look at the timer. So the point about that is that it takes time. Like you get distracted, then you subtract, then you recalculate, then you recalibrate, then you stress out a little bit, then you try to get undistracted. I mean, that whole process is totally like 15 seconds every time you look at a clock. So if you look at the clock every single problem, you can waste as much as 10 minutes on each section. Just looking at the clock. Like literally you can spend a combined total of 10 minutes, completely wasted time, just looking at the clock. And then if the timer is on the screen but you don't look at it, then it's sort of like, it's just this constant thing that's pulling on your mind. I mean, it's a lot like, it's like having your favorite food on the table while you are trying to fast. it's just a constant distraction. Like if you're fasting and your favorite food is right in front of you and you smell it all the time and it's just kind of there, it's going to distract you from whatever you're trying to do because, oh my gosh, that food smells so good. Oh my gosh, I know there's a timer on the screen. I know that I really want to look at it, and then I'm not. So in general, having a timer is bad. If it's on the screen and you look at it all the time, it's bad. If it's on the screen and you don't look at it, it's a different kind of bad. So you should generally hide the timer. How often should you look at it? Not very often. You shouldn't have to look at it more often than every, say, 5 to 10 problems. I mean, in our materials and in our labs and stuff like that, we have these timing map type things. And that's the point of those. And those are not just random timing maps. Like the point of those is that those are the only time that you should ever have to look at the clock. Like here's an example of a timing map. I don't remember which numbers are necessarily in the ones that are in our books or labs or whatever. But here's a sample timing map for quads. So when you are on a problem number, when you finish a problem number, you should have a certain amount of time left. So let's build this up from the bottom. Like when you finish problem number 37, you should be basically done. So let's say you have like a minute left. So then that means when you finish problem 27, you should have about 21 minutes left. When you finish problem 17, you should have about 41 minutes left. And when you finish problem number 7, you should have about 61 minutes left. So the point of having a timing map like this, and then if you want the fives, like if you want 7, 12, 17, 22, 27, 32, then it'd be 61, 51, 41, 31, and so on. Like, I like this map because these numbers are very, very easy to remember. So, and remember these are approximate times too. But the whole point of this whole timing map situation is that these should be the only times when you ever look at the timer. So like when you finish problem 7, unhide the timer and look at it and see how you are relative to 61 minutes. Then don't look at the timer again until you finish problem 17 and then pull it out and look at it. Then don't look at the timer until you finish problem 27 and then pull it out and look at it. And in between, what should keep you from falling off the wagon here is that you actually have the discipline to manage time properly. So this is what I mean. What if we realize we've fallen behind a lot? The point is that you shouldn't. If you do fall behind a lot, it means you don't have self-discipline with managing time. Like it means you are not quitting when you are stuck. So like if you can't maintain your time management without looking at the timer constantly, that's a problem and you have to fix it. It means that you have to learn to quit earlier. It means you have to learn to manage time better than you have been. It doesn't mean you need to look at the timer more often. It means you need to get better at quitting. And that's the whole point. Like you in between these time intervals, you need to have enough self-discipline to A, know when you are stuck, and B, if you are stuck, quit. That's basically the secret. So, in between, A, you have to be very honest with yourself about when you are stuck, and then B, quit if you are stuck. Remember, there are two kinds of stuck. The first kind is I'm just sitting there staring at the problem. I think most of us realize that that is stuck. But the other kind of stuck is I'm just like moving things around. If it's a math problem, I'm just kind of moving variables around and hoping that a miracle happens. If it's a verbal problem, I'm just kind of like staring at the words and hoping that I have an epiphany. Those are not good. If you're doing those things, you just have to stop and quit. For verbal, it's basically the same thing with an additional problem on each row. So in this color, let's say verbal. So this will be problem number 8 instead of 7. This will be problem number 29, 40. What am I doing? 19, 30. This should be 19. And then 41. So instead of going up by 10, it goes up by 11. You're not going to get the verbal map to be super pretty because it's, the numbers are not pretty. It's 41 problems in 75 minutes, which is a very awkward amount of time per problem. So unlike quant, you're not going to have this neat little 7, 17, 27, 37 kind of thing. If you're behind 3 or 4 minutes, it's not very long. I mean, if you're behind by 3 or 4 minutes and it's early in the test, you just keep going. If you're behind late in the test by that much, guess 1 or 2 problems, and then you can be back on track. Okay, let's move on to another assumption problem here. And then we will take it from there. So here's another assumption problem. Try this. Here's a timer. Go for it. Okay, if you don't yet have an answer to this problem, please pick one. Okay, it's still Amit and okay, so a couple of you still have non-responses here. Remember that you got to answer every problem on the GMAT. So okay, so here's what you guys got. So there's a pretty strong majority here in favor of D. But let's take a look. So remember to personalize it, put it in your own words. Let's say, yeah, Kapil, we can't talk about OG problems here. So unfortunately, can't talk about that. Okay, so put it in your own words, personalize it. Imagine you're actually having a conversation. So more conversational language. Sorry, there's your answers. Okay, you shouldn't be able to see them again. My Illuminate here is being sort of buggy. Apologize for that. Okay, in more conversational language. What this says is, and again, you should be putting this in your own words as you read it, kind of like I'm doing here. Basically, the information gets a little bit more sugar-coated every time it goes up. So when there's bad news, it gets nicer each time the news is passed up to someone at a higher level. So therefore, the CEO will have the least accurate idea of the actual bad news. pretty much what this says. So I mean, the logic here is that, you know, every time the information is passed up, it gets more distorted. So the logic here is that the CEO has had the information passed up the most number of times. Like, the argument basically relies on this idea that the CEO has to get the information through everybody else. Like, it has to be passed up to the next person, then the next person, then the next person, until it finally gets to the CEO. So what you can do here is you can object to this argument. Well, it doesn't, okay, Emmanuel, doesn't this mean that bad news is bad news? We're only talking about bad news. See, the word problems is here. So we don't really care how much of the news is bad news. We're just talking about what happens if it is bad news. Okay, but what you can do here is you can challenge this argument. Remember, you can't challenge the explicitly stated premises. So if it says that information gets distorted as it gets passed up, then information really gets distorted as it's passed up. That you can't question. But what you can challenge is the ideas that are in there that make it work but are not explicitly stated. Like, this argument relies on this idea that the CEO has to get the information through a chain of people. So one way that you could challenge this argument is, what if the CEO gets the information directly from people at lower levels rather than from the people directly below him or her? Because that's a challenge to the argument. In other words, like, what if the people in the mail room actually just contact the CEO directly and say, hey, here's this problem? So the point of assumptions is that, you know, if you have, for any potential challenge, for any challenge you can think of, you need an assumption to defeat that challenge. And I mean, in some cases, there's a lot of these. You might not be able to think of the exact challenge right away. But here, if you think of this particular challenge, you need to assume in this argument that the CEO doesn't. Like, the CEO only gets information from the next lower level, the level directly below. Or you can say the CEO doesn't get information from closer to the bottom. So that's choice D here. You can also do this by negation. You can also make that happen. If you negate choice D, then chief executives obtain this information from no source other than their subordinates. So negating this is not very hard. You just say they do sometimes obtain the information from a source other than their direct subordinate. So executives do sometimes obtain info from sources other than direct subordinates. If you have this, again, the argument is destroyed, because the argument fundamentally relies on the idea that that doesn't happen. I mean, as far as taking out the no, you've got to be careful with that, because sometimes it doesn't quite work that way. Like, if you say, I don't know, no person in this room is tall, then, I mean, you have to rephrase that to, like, someone is tall, or I guess you could say a person. just think, don't automatically take out the word no. Make sure you're thinking about that. Then we go from bad news to serious problems. So you could, Emmanuel, you might potentially have something that would capitalize on the difference between serious problems and just problems. Like that is somewhere they could go. Although they didn't go there in this argument. I mean, so the key here is that you can't be too personally invested in expecting a particular answer. I mean, make sure you don't do that. It's okay to try to come up with particular answers, but it's not okay to like expect the answer you come up with to be there. So it depends on what you mean by I expected. If I expected here just means I kind of had this general idea in mind, then that's fine. But if I expected means this is like the answer choice that I was looking for and I assumed that anything else was wrong, then that is totally not fine. So just make sure you, like, whichever one of those it is. Like, remember that most arguments have lots and lots of assumptions. So if you can think of an assumption, then good, but make sure you don't have a mind that's closed off to other assumptions. Like here's a really kind of dumb argument, but it works here. Like right now it's 5 p.m. here. So if I leave now, I can drive to Portland, Oregon by 5 a.m. I mean, okay, so there's plenty of assumptions here that you can make. I mean, what are the assumptions? Well, one way you can find assumptions here is to just directly see what's missing. So one assumption here, we got to connect the 5 a.m. and the 5 p.m. So one assumption I've got to make is that I can actually drive to Portland in 12 hours or less. So there's that. It's kind of the only stuff that really has to be connected there, other than, I have a car or whatever. Or you could try to challenge the argument. So in this case, there's plenty of challenges that you could make. So possible challenges, and then what assumption comes out of those. So like one challenge that you can make here is, what if there's lots of traffic? What if there's an unusual amount of traffic? So, well, you have to assume there won't be an unusual amount of traffic. What if my car breaks down? Well, I have to assume that my car won't break down, et cetera, et cetera. Like, there's so many things, what if there's an accident? So there won't be one, et cetera. So the point is that all of these are assumptions, and I think this is kind of a stupid little problem, but it definitely illustrates why you should not literally expect a particular answer. Like if I expect that the answer is going to be this, I mean, is this an assumption? Yes, it is. But if they could also give me that one or that one or that one or quite a few others. So, if all my eggs are in one basket here, if I'm totally like relying on the idea that my first guess will come up, then I'm in trouble. But if I come up with that and I still have an open mind to other possibilities, then I am not in trouble. That's kind of the idea. Okay, let's do another problem. Try this. Right here. Here's a timer. Okay, some decently large number of you don't have answers yet, so please pick one. C, Whittle, you don't have one. Well, I noticed you've been kind of logged in and out. Jenny and Zara, please pick an answer in the next 10 seconds. Thanks. If someone's still seeing other people's choices, you shouldn't, because I just checked and it is turned off. So if you are seeing other people's choices, I don't, unless you're a moderator, which shouldn't. Okay, here's what you guys picked. So we're kind of all over the place on this one. So let's personalize it, pretend it's a conversation, put it into our own words, that whole thing. Personalize it, put into your own words. Yeah. Okay, so traditionally, people have thought, traditionally this is not part of the argument. Like notice that the actual argument starts right here. This is just background up until that point. Like they're saying traditionally here's what people have thought. Meaning this is just, oh, people have thought this for a while. Meaning it's not part of the argument here, but it gives like a motivation for why we would want to even be talking about this topic. But the argument is basically here. So the argument is actually pretty simple. It's, yeah, timing-wise, Emmanuel, that's probably not going to work because for someone to type that out for someone to type out something in their own words would take a very long time. And generally, we don't want to mess around with microphones and stuff either because that's sort of awkward for everybody. But it's a good idea, but in terms of logistics, probably not great. Okay. The argument starts there, so basically it's just top managers use intuition more often than lower level managers do. So the argument concludes, if I'm talking to someone like John is telling me, my friend, I read this article. John says, all right, top managers use intuition more. So John says, I think intuition is better. So intuition must be more effective than methodical reasoning. So what you can probably see a lot more easily if you put this into your own words is there's a pretty gigantic jump in the argument here. Where's the big jump? Go ahead and tell me in the text box. Where is there a really big jump in this argument? Yeah. There's two versions of this. Let me put these on the board and talk about them. The first one, the first person wrote this. This is not the jump, because if you look at how this argument proceeds, they don't jump from intuitive to anything else, because intuitive is still there. So there's no logic jump there, because there's intuition and there's also intuition. So there's no jump happening here. Like, we were talking about intuition before, and we are still talking about intuition. So these are exactly the same topic, therefore no jump. But it's the second one of these that is correct. So here, no jump. But if you look at what happens in this other part, I mean, top managers use something more often. And then, whoa, it must be more effective. Top managers use it more often. Therefore, it must be more effective. There's my weirdly big jump in this argument, which is top managers do something more often is treated as though it were equivalent to it's more effective. And I mean, they basically just made that up out of nowhere, right? I mean, top managers do something more often. I mean, it's a reasonable thought. You might think, okay, that's how these people got to be top managers in the first place. But the point at the end of the day is that it's totally unsupported. It's just kind of a made-up association that's out of nowhere. So that's the kind of thing that you need an assumption to support, and the assumption that supports that is that top managers actually are more effective at what they do. So if you have choice E, that actually gets you from top managers do it to it's more effective. So just to make sure you guys who are watching the screen, this is not the right jump. This is the jump that's actually happening. So if you see that, if you notice that, you can anticipate what the assumption is going to be. Again, you shouldn't be closed off to other possibilities, but you can kind of see where they're going with this. If you do a negation method on this choice, if you do a negation of choice E, you get top managers are no more effective. They're not any more effective than middle or lower level managers. If that's true, I think you can see that this argument gets destroyed. Because if that's true, then this conclusion literally has no support anymore, because there's no effectiveness. So if this is true, then the conclusion no longer has any support. As far as other choices go, it looks like choice B and C were decently popular here. C, the problem with C is that it introduces this idea that's irrelevant to everything, which is the idea of easily. I mean, easiness or difficulty or lack of difficulty or whatever you want to call it is a non-issue in this argument. This is not something they ever talk about. So the argument never considers easy or not easy. And then as far as B goes, B basically says that they have a choice between the two. And I mean, what's interesting here is they don't necessarily have to have a choice. Let's try negating choice B. If you make a negation of choice B, it basically says that top managers don't have a choice. in when to do these things. So they have to use intuition when they have to, and they have to use methodical reasoning when that's necessary. Even if you have that, it doesn't destroy the argument. I mean, like, even if the executives are using intuition because they have to, if it's more effective, it's still more effective. So the problem with choice B, like, choice B seems like a very reasonable thing. But even though it's perfectly reasonable, it's not necessary to the argument. Like, you don't need to assume that these people are actually choosing freely between two. Any questions? Go ahead and type them. Otherwise, we got time to do, it looks like, one more of these before we close up. So, okay. One person is typing something. So, yes, we can wait a little bit and see what that is. Okay. Let's go ahead and move on to the next problem. Now, whatever the question is, we can try to circle around later and grab it. How about this? Okay, a lot of you still don't have answers. There's 24 of you here right now, and only like 14 of you have answers. So please pick one, next 5-10 seconds, and we'll go. Okay, so here are your statistics. Pretty strong majority in favor of D here, but we've still got some noise from the other choices. So, well, let's take a look. In our own, remember, put it in your own words. Even if you're not changing too much, it still helps you to personalize and understand. So in my own words, like, basically some microwaves have clocks. So microwaves have clocks, and those use power all the time. Those use about 45 kilowatt hours of power per year. So if you have one of those, you will use 45 kilowatt hours more than you would otherwise, if you being a household, right? So remember that when you try to find the assumption directly, you're generally talking about one of two things. I mean, you could be talking about trying to identify a jump in the logic, but here you're not really going to be able to do that. Because if you think about this, logic has no jumps at all, like literally none. I mean, this is 45 kilowatt hours, so if you would have used X, then that's X plus 45. There are clearly no jumps of logic here, because X plus 45 is X plus 45. On the other hand, what you can also do is you can try to challenge the argument. And I mean, remember that when you challenge arguments, you have to challenge them with outside ideas. Because like the one thing you're not going to do is challenge like the material facts of the argument. Like if the argument says that something is a fact, then it's a fact, and you can't really question it. So if you're going to challenge the argument, you got to do it with an idea that comes from outside. So, for instance, one legitimate challenge you could raise here would be something like, what if people don't have a normal clock because their microwave has a clock? So if you realize that's an objection, and it's a very legitimate objection, like a lot of people might not want another clock if they already have one in their microchip. So if you need to defeat, you can defeat this particular objection. And so that's choice D. Finally, you can also negate. If you negate choice E, this is what, you can't just autopilot. You can't go through and just kill the word not. Because you can't eliminate this not. That's not the right negation. We're talking about people who don't have microwaves. People who without microwaves are no more likely to have a separate electric clock. So if you negate this, then you get they are more likely. So these households are more likely to have a separate clock. So if that's true, then it's the same idea as this challenge. The advantage of the negation thing is you don't have to come up with it yourself. Like the negation thing is you take their choice and you just make it opposite and see what happens. But if those households are more likely to have a separate clock, then it'll chip away at this 45 kilowatt hours. So same sort of idea that's in this challenge here. A was a decently popular wrong answer. The problem here is that you're making a comparison that's irrelevant. Like A is comparing two groups that the argument doesn't compare. Like we don't compare households with microwaves and households without. This is totally the wrong comparison. The comparison in the argument is like a hypothetical household versus the exact same hypothetical household if you take away the clock on their microwave. It's not between two totally different demographic groups. So, and what you can do is, that helps you do that is, again, this whole personalizing the argument, put it into your own words, that whole thing. Like if you take your own words and you actually do something like this, if you have one, then here's what would happen versus otherwise, then you don't run into these issues. Like if you saw this, you would be like, oh, that's not what we're talking about. We're not comparing these groups to each other. We're comparing same thing with and without the clock. Any quick questions here, go ahead and throw them in the box. Otherwise, we're going to close up shop for the day. Thanks for attending. If you have any quick administrative questions, this would be the time. This is not the time to submit problems, by the way, or topics. And you're welcome. And this is not the time to, ask more problems. But if you have any quick admin type thingies, then now's the time. Otherwise, good night and good luck. And have an excellent 2 weeks. And we'll see you later.